Hello. For my topic, I chose the French Revolution. We cannot talk about the French Revolution, however, without talking about the Enlightenment period. The Enlightenment period was from 1650 to 1781. It can be best described as a European intellectual and cultural movement. There were many important ideas and philosophies to come out during this period. For example, the idea of freedoms of speech, religion, freedom of the presses, and freedom to vote all came from these Enlightenment philosophers like John Locke. You could even argue that this era of radical change in ideas of government and human roles caused our own country, the United States, revolution back in 1776. And in France, it is seen as this is where the Enlightenment period reached its highest development. Which brings us to the French Revolution from 1789 to 1799. There were many large causes to the revolution, like the Enlightenment period, but the biggest was probably social inequality. There was a total of three estates in France during this time. The first and most powerful were the clergy, which was around 130,000 people. The second estate was the nobility at 350,000 people, and the third estate, which was everyone else, like peasants and farmers, at 27 million. The third estate was constantly facing high and unequal taxes. There was also a huge and extreme famine in 1789 that caused France to go into a depression economically. These huge economic factors threw France into a radical want and need for the revolution. And on June 20th, 1789, members of the Third Estate took it upon themselves to defy the other estates and King Louis XVI of France and swore to never disband until they wrote a new constitution. Shortly after this, on July 14th, 1789, the people of France decided to arm themselves to protect themselves and from a possible suppression of the king. They stormed the Bastille, which was at this time an older prison that had a huge weapon cache, so they could fend off any domestic and possible foreign threats to the revolution. Next we have in August of 1789, the Third Estate finally finishes their new Declaration of Independence. They call theirs the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, which was full of Enlightenment period philosophical ideas. Sadly, during this time, however, France is still suffering from their famine, and on October 5th, 1789, rumors spread that the king's overly lavish wife, Marie Antoinette, was hoarding grains at their palace in Versailles. So there was a huge march of women that were armed, and they marched to the palace and broke in, demanding bread and grain, and resulted in the king and queen moving back to Paris so the revolutionaries could make sure they are still not living lavishly. So basically, the king and France at this time are under house arrest in Paris, to be watched. Fast forward a year, in 1791, King Louis and Marie Antoinette decide they need to flee Paris for safety, but they were spotted and taken captive. This infuriates more radical politicians during this time, known as the Jacobins, who now advocate for an elimination of the monarch, which people still wanted at this time, and now they want to form a republic. This would eventually lead to the Declaration of Pilms, where the Holy Roman Empire and the country of Prussia urged other European powers to help restore the French monarch. This infuriates an already angry French people, and they are still suffering from a famine at this time. I keep mentioning famine because it's you cannot underestimate how hungry these people are and makes them more angry. All of these events will take France into one of the bloodiest and radical revolutions in human history, known as the Reign of Terror. The Reign of Terror begins in August of 1792 by radical revolutionaries who capture and imprison the king and queen and execute them on January 21st, 1793 by guillotine. The Reign of Terror was led by Maximilien Robespierre, who executed anyone who he deemed possibly counter-revolutionary. During this time of terror, from 1793 to 1794, it's believed over 40,000 men and women are executed on suspicion alone. The Terror ends with the execution of Robespierre because his suspicious ways made other people too suspicious of him, and he was executed by guillotine in July of 1794, ironically. In August of 1795, the completed and new French Constitution is ratified, finally makes France a republic, ending the French Revolution. The French Revolution is important because it was the beginning of modern democracy in Europe and is still present to this day. The birth of modern democracy in Europe ended the oligarchies. It's also important because it started the rise of modern nationalism, and nationalism is an ideology that emphasizes loyalty and devotion to a nation. I chose this topic because in previous courses and classes, the French Revolution is overlooked and skipped over or briefly discussed. I wanted to learn more in detail what happened and why, and I'm really happy I chose this topic. The French Revolution is very important today because it teaches us the hardships and struggle to achieve a democracy. It shows us the lengths to what people were willing to do, good and bad. Good being the creation of a new and free society, bad being the obvious reign of terror, and how scary and how far people are willing to go to overthrow oppressive forces. These are my citations. Thank you.